you or maybe a family member or a friend or a coworker who has repeated infections or chronic gut illness like irritable bowel syndrome or SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or maybe inflammatory bowel disease, or maybe they have a condition that repeatedly, just infection after infection, maybe in the bladder, like chronic interstitial cystitis. Many people have that. And maybe chronic prostatitis, inflammation of the prostate, that just conditions that just won't go away. Maybe you have wounds that won't heal. Maybe they've been there for forever and you just can't find a solution. Maybe you've been treated with antibiotics multiple times for infections of the gut, like H. pylori or C. difficile, and yet they just keep on coming back. The number one cause of these chronic conditions that just won't go away, and the doctors just scratch their heads and just say, can't figure it out. And you're stuck in the middle. You're just suffering with this problem and you don't know what to do yourself. You're just absolutely frustrated with it. The number one cause of these chronic conditions, they're called biofilms. Bacteria communities inside of this biofilm, inside of this bubble that's surrounded by this mucus layer. Biofilms are all around us in nature. They're evident in so many things. They're in minerals and metals and in plants. Algae you see on top of ponds, that green algae in the summertime, that's a biofilm. And that's a growth of microorganisms that are protected inside of what's called this biofilm, or this community that is surrounded by slime. So you see that slime on the pond? Well, that's the biofilm. And our gut is a place where biofilms will form. The mucus layer protects the lining of the gut. But if we end up with biofilms that begin to proliferate, microorganisms that grow inside of this slime, it'll start to break down the lining of the gut and we'll end up with leaky gut. Then we end up with conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. And if we have this biofilm that forms in the small intestine, and we end up with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or we end up with chronic inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis down in the colon, or Crohn's. In our small intestine should have very few bacteria living there. But when you have an overgrowth of the bacteria in the small intestine, then you get this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and you end up having many, many complications. And so there's a lot of symptoms that people end up getting, like problems with brain fog and fatigue and digestive disturbances and sleep problems. And it just goes on and on, all the symptoms that can occur from that, and the suppressed immune system, a compromised immune system. So once again, the gut can harbor these biofilms, communities, whole cities of these microorganisms that form inside of these communities that have a covering, a protective coating, a slime around them so that they're hard to penetrate. And they're even make them antibiotic resistant. So when you have people who have repeated infections, whether it's in the mouth, like gingivitis, or you have something of nature of the cystitis in the bladder or the prostate, or you've got inflammation like in the gut because you got the inflammatory bowel disease, like the Crohn's disease or the ulcerative colitis. And the doctor is trying to treat those things with antibiotics, but they're not working. It's because these bacteria, these communities inside of this biofilm, inside of this bubble that's surrounded by this mucus layer, the antibiotics oftentimes get rid of them. As a matter of fact, the antibiotics will cause them to become stronger. How many people do you know that have had an infection anywhere in the body and the doctor prescribes some antibiotics, and the antibiotics may kill off 80 or 90% of those bacteria that caused that infection, but there's going to be 10 or 20% that are going to be left over that are still living there. And as they lurk back in the recesses of wherever part of the body that it's at, when you are not eating healthy or getting stressed out, or you're not getting enough sleep, or any number of things, your immune system becomes compromised, and those microorganisms that are still living inside of you will start to multiply. And then the doctor ends up treating you again because you have another infection, and they go ahead and treat you with the antibiotic again. And then some of those bacteria will still survive that second treatment. And then the next generation will become even stronger. And they now have that community where they go back to, the ones that are still living, that 10 or 20%, and they communicate with each other. They communicate through what's called quorum signaling or quorum sensing. And that signaling is a communication that they have and that they do through a chemical process. They have enzymes on the cell surface, and that is the messaging unit that they use to communicate with each other microorganisms inside of that biofilm. So these communities start to form, and now they become antibiotic resistant, and they communicate with each other. And not only that, but these microorganisms could not only just have bacteria, you could have viruses, and you could have yeast and fungi and protozoa and all kinds of different microorganisms living inside of that biofilm. And now they become very, very deleterious, very harmful, because they give out a lot of toxins. And when they're in the gut, it's one of the worst places to be, because on the lining of the gut, you've got that mucus, but you've got nutrients that are coming in. So they've got food, they've got fluid, and they've got the moisture, and they've got all the things that they need, and they form these very sophisticated communities where they have these channels inside of the biofilm to receive nutrients and get rid of waste. And they're living in the gut, which is like a haven for them, so they can continue to proliferate. And they become very resistant to these antibiotics. They become very resistant to the anti-inflammatories that the doctors are prescribing, because of the fact that they have developed a resistance, especially to the antibiotics. So my friends, these communities of this, they're living inside this biofilm, are very sophisticated. And medicine today cannot overcome these things, but we have natural things that we'll talk about tonight that are so absolutely marvelous healing agents. They're called the biofilm disruptors. They actually break down what we call the matrix, or that whole mucus layer that's got several different layers. And the natural remedies can actually break those layers down and disrupt them, and then expose the microorganisms. And then we use natural antimicrobials instead of using antibiotics, which again, very, very harmful in the long run, because they kill off the good bacteria as well as the bad. But the herbs don't do that. The natural remedies don't do that. Listen to my podcast, The Number One Cause of Repeated Infections and Chronic Gut Illness, and find out the herbs that will break open the biofilm, disrupt it, and kill the microorganisms that are living inside of it. See the link listed in the comments.